Every single day, billions of people do something so ordinary, so routine, so familiar, they never stop to question it. They open the refrigerator, take out yesterday's leftovers, put them into a microwave or onto a stovetop, heat them until they are steaming, and eat them with complete peace of mind. Most people believe one simple rule: if the food is hot enough, it must be safe enough. That belief feels logical. It feels practical. It feels harmless. But in some cases, it is dangerously incomplete. Because the truth is, not all leftovers are created equal. Not all foods respond the same way after they have been cooked, cooled, stored, and heated again. Some foods mainly lose texture. Some lose nutrients. And some can go through biochemical or microbial changes that make them much less ideal, and in certain situations, significantly more risky, the second time around. And that is what makes this topic so important. The danger is not always dramatic. It does not always announce itself with a foul smell, a strange color, or an obviously spoiled appearance. Sometimes the food looks normal. It smells normal. It tastes normal. And yet the chemistry has changed, the structure has changed, or the microbial risk has changed in ways most people never think about. So today, I want to walk you through 4 foods people reheat all the time, foods that are commonly seen as safe, healthy, and convenient, but that deserve much more caution than they usually get. Rice, chicken, leafy greens like spinach, and eggs. Now let me say this right at the start. This is not about panic. This is not about pretending every leftover meal is toxic. And this is definitely not about making you afraid of normal life. This is about understanding where the real risks are, where the myths are, and where convenience may be quietly working against you. Because once you understand what actually happens to certain foods during storage and reheating, you start looking at leftovers very differently. What makes this especially important is that most people who are exposed to these risks are not reckless eaters. They are often the exact opposite. They are busy parents trying to reduce waste. They are students trying to stretch their budget. They are professionals meal prepping for the week. They are fitness-conscious people eating rice, lean protein, vegetables, and eggs because they believe those foods support long-term health. In other words, the people most likely to reheat these foods are often the people trying hardest to do the right thing. That is why this conversation matters. Before we get into the foods themselves, I need you to understand one basic principle. When you cook food the first time, heat changes it in ways that are mostly expected. Proteins unfold. Starches soften. Moisture redistributes. Fats melt. Sugars caramelize. All of that is normal. But once that food cools down and sits in storage, even in the refrigerator, it is no longer exactly the same food it was the moment you finished cooking it. During storage, oxygen exposure, moisture shifts, temperature fluctuations, enzyme activity, and microbial activity can all begin to alter the food. That means when you heat it a second time, you are not just replaying the original cooking process. You are applying heat to something that has already changed. And that second wave of change is where problems can begin. Sometimes the problem is bacterial. Sometimes it is about heat-stable toxins. Sometimes it is about oxidation. Sometimes it is about high-heat compounds that become more concerning when food is repeatedly overcooked or overheated. The key point is this: the phrase "just reheat it" is far too simple for what is actually happening. So let's begin with the first food, and arguably the most underestimated one on this entire list: rice. Rice is one of the most widely consumed staple foods on Earth. It is cheap, filling, easy to prepare, and deeply embedded in daily eating habits across the world. For millions of households, cooking extra rice is normal. In fact, for many people, leftover rice is not the exception, it is the plan. And that is exactly why this matters so much. The issue with rice is not mainly that reheating creates a dramatic new carcinogen out of nowhere. The more immediate and scientifically established concern is food safety, specifically the risk involving a bacterium called Bacillus cereus. This organism is commonly associated with rice because its spores can survive the original cooking process. If the rice is then left at room temperature too long, or cooled too slowly, those spores can germinate, multiply, and produce toxins. Here is the part that most people do not know: reheating the rice may kill the bacteria, but it does not reliably eliminate the toxins that were already produced. That means a person can take rice that was handled poorly, microwave it until it is steaming hot, and still end up eating a food that is no longer safe in the way they assume it is. This is one of the clearest examples of why "heat it again" is not always enough. And what makes rice especially tricky is that people often underestimate how casually they handle it. They cook it, leave it on the counter while eating dinner, come back later, put it away, maybe leave it out again the next day, then reheat it once, maybe twice. Every delay, every temperature window, Every extra cycle increases the chance that what was once safe is moving in the wrong direction. Now, beyond the bacterial issue, rice can also become less desirable when repeatedly heated and dried out at high temperatures. Texture changes are obvious, but chemical changes can also occur depending on the method and intensity of heating. This is why rice is a food that should be handled with precision.
Cool it quickly.
Refrigerate it promptly. Store it properly.
Reheat it only once.
And if there is any doubt about how long it sat out, do not gamble with it. One of the most dangerous habits people have is thinking that because rice seems plain and harmless, it must also be low risk. In reality, its simplicity is exactly what disarms people. Nobody is suspicious of rice. And that is why it catches people off guard. Now let's move to a food that many health-conscious people practically build their lives around: chicken. Chicken has become the symbol of clean eating.
It is what bodybuilders eat.
It is what people preparing weight loss meals rely on. It is what parents cook when they want something leaner than red meat. It is what doctors and dietitians often recommend when someone wants a simple, high-protein option. And because it is so commonly batch-cooked, it is also one of the most frequently reheated foods in the modern diet. But chicken presents a different type of concern. When muscle meats are cooked at high temperatures, especially grilling, pan-frying, broiling, or charring, they can form compounds called heterocyclic amines, often referred to as HCAs. These compounds have been studied extensively because of their potential to damage DNA after metabolic activation in the body. The hotter the surface temperature, the longer the exposure, and the more intense the browning or charring, the greater the concern becomes. Now think about what many people do with leftover chicken. The chicken may already have been cooked thoroughly the first time, maybe even aggressively. Then the next day, it gets thrown into a hot pan, reheated in an oven until dry, or microwaved unevenly until parts of it become rubbery and overcooked. In other words, the food is not merely being warmed, it is often being cooked again. That repeated high heat exposure is where the problem grows. To be clear, the real concern is not that one serving of reheated chicken will suddenly create cancer. That is not how biology works. The concern is about repeated dietary exposure, repeated overheating, repeated formation of unwanted compounds, and repeated stress placed on the body over time. Cancer risk, when it comes to food, is rarely about one meal. It is about patterns. It is about frequency. It is about habits that seem harmless because they are ordinary. And chicken is the perfect example of an ordinary habit. What is even more ironic is that people who rely on meal prep often believe they are being exceptionally disciplined. They are controlling calories. They are prioritizing protein. They are staying away from processed junk food. But if they are repeatedly overheating pre-cooked chicken until it is browned, dry, and tough, they may be introducing a different kind of problem through the very routine they trust the most. So what is the smarter approach? If you are reheating cooked chicken, use the lowest effective heat needed to warm it safely. Add moisture if necessary. Avoid turning reheating into recooking. Better yet, in many cases, leftover chicken is perfectly suitable cold, sliced into salads, wraps, bowls, or sandwiches, without forcing it through another harsh heating cycle. Now we come to the third category, and this is where a lot of people get genuinely surprised: spinach and other nitrate-rich leafy greens. Spinach has an almost perfect reputation. It is nutrient-dense, fiber-rich, associated with healthy eating, and praised in nearly every wellness conversation. And honestly, it deserves much of that praise. Fresh spinach, properly prepared, can absolutely be part of an excellent diet. But healthy foods are not magically immune to poor handling. Leafy greens like spinach naturally contain nitrates. In the right context, nitrates are not automatically harmful. In fact, they can play beneficial roles in the body. The problem is that under certain storage conditions, especially after cooking, some of those nitrates can be converted into nitrites. And nitrites, depending on the conditions they encounter, can contribute to the formation of nitrosamine compounds, a class of compounds that has been examined very seriously in cancer research. This is where nuance matters. People often hear a simplified version of this topic and walk away with the wrong conclusion. They either think, spinach is dangerous, which is false, or they think, this is just a myth, which is also too simplistic. The more accurate truth is this: spinach itself is not the villain. The issue is how a nitrate-rich leafy vegetable behaves after it has been cooked, stored, and then reheated. That difference matters enormously. A freshly cooked spinach dish eaten right away is not the same as cooked spinach left sitting, refrigerated, then reheated later without much thought. Storage time matters. Temperature control matters. Reheating practices matter. And because spinach is usually viewed as one of the healthiest things a person can eat, people rarely apply caution to it. This is exactly how risk hides. Not in foods people fear, but in foods people trust blindly. There is another psychological layer here that is worth paying attention to. Many people are skeptical of fast food, processed snacks, and sugary drinks. But they completely lower their guard around healthy foods. Once a food is mentally labeled as clean or beneficial, people stop asking questions. They assume every version of it, under every condition, remains equally beneficial. But food science does not work that way. A food can be healthy in one context and much less ideal in another. So with spinach and similar vegetables, the wiser strategy is to cook what you plan to eat it relatively soon, store leftovers correctly if needed, and avoid making repeated reheating a normal habit. And now we come to the fourth food, the one many people least expect to see on this list: eggs. Eggs are among the most respected foods in modern nutrition. They are rich in protein, highly convenient, relatively affordable, and loaded with useful nutrients. For breakfast meal prep, post-workout meals, low-carb diets, high-protein plans, and family cooking, eggs are everywhere. But eggs are also highly sensitive to repeated heating in ways most people notice without fully understanding. Reheated eggs often smell stronger. The texture becomes rubbery. The flavor becomes flat or sulfur-heavy. The structure changes quickly. And those sensory clues are not random. They are evidence that this is a food that does not tolerate aggressive reheating very gracefully. The yolk contains fat and cholesterol-containing compounds, and with repeated heat exposure, oxidation becomes a more relevant concern. Researchers have long studied oxidized cholesterol derivatives and lipid oxidation products because of their biological activity. Again, this is not about creating irrational fear around a breakfast food. It is about recognizing that eggs are best when treated gently, not cooked hard, chilled, and then blasted with high heat again. This is especially true in the microwave, where reheating can be uneven, rapid, and harsh.
The proteins tighten more. The texture deteriorates.
The aroma worsens. And the food clearly becomes less stable and less appealing than it was originally. What makes eggs particularly deceptive is that people often think of them as one of the purest foods they can eat. And nutritionally, they can be excellent. But purity of image does not mean immunity to poor preparation habits. Hard-boiled eggs, for example, are often much better eaten cold if stored properly. Scrambled eggs, omelets, and other egg-based dishes are usually best eaten fresh. If they absolutely must be reheated, gentle heat is the better option. The mistake is taking a food that was already cooked to completion and pushing it through a second intense heating cycle for convenience. Now step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture, because this is where the real value of this conversation comes in. Rice, chicken, spinach, and eggs do not all become risky for the same reason.
That is important.
Rice is mostly a storage and toxin problem. Chicken is more about high-heat cooking compounds and repeated overheating. Spinach is about nitrate chemistry under certain handling conditions. Eggs are more vulnerable to oxidative and structural degradation when reheated aggressively.
Different foods.
Different mechanisms. Different reasons for caution. But there is one common thread connecting all of them. People treat reheating like a harmless reset button.
As if heat erases the past.
As if the refrigerator freezes chemistry. As if the food becomes brand new the second steam appears.
It does not.
Reheating does not rewind time. It does not undo unsafe storage. It does not reverse oxidation. It does not magically restore freshness. And in some situations, it can intensify the very problems that started while the food was sitting in the fridge. That is the key mindset shift I want you to walk away with. The goal here is not to stop eating leftovers entirely. That would be unrealistic and unnecessary. The goal is to stop treating all leftovers as equal. The goal is to understand that some foods deserve more caution than others, some handling mistakes matter more than others, and some reheating habits are worth changing immediately. So what should you actually do from this point forward?
First, cool cooked food promptly.
The longer food sits in the danger zone between hot and cold, the more opportunities you create for microbial growth or chemical deterioration. Second, refrigerate leftovers properly and in a timely manner. Do not leave them out for hours assuming you will deal with them later. Third, avoid reheating the same food multiple times. Repeated cycles of heating and cooling are one of the easiest ways to turn an acceptable leftover into a questionable one. Fourth, be particularly careful with cooked rice. If it was stored carelessly, do not trust reheating to save it. Fifth, do not aggressively recook leftover chicken. Warm it gently or eat it cold when appropriate. Sixth, be cautious with cooked leafy greens like spinach, especially if they have been stored and are being reheated later. Seventh, treat eggs as a food that is far better fresh than repeatedly reheated. And finally, trust patterns more than single experiences. A lot of people defend risky habits by saying, "I've done this for years and I'm fine." But that is not how health risk works. Many harmful patterns do not produce immediate consequences. Sometimes the body absorbs insult quietly for years before the cost becomes visible. That is why food science matters. Not because every meal is a threat, but because repeated exposure to the wrong conditions can accumulate in ways that feel invisible, until they are not. If there is one message I want to leave you with, it is this: convenience should never completely replace awareness. The modern kitchen is full of shortcuts.
Batch cooking, meal prep, leftovers,
Microwave reheating. None of these are inherently bad. But when convenience becomes automatic, people stop thinking. And when people stop thinking, they stop noticing where risk begins. The difference between a smart leftover and a risky leftover is often just a few simple decisions. How fast you cooled it, how long you stored it, what temperature you reheated it at, and whether that food was a good candidate for reheating in the first place. That is not complicated.
but it is powerful.
Because health is rarely shaped by one dramatic event. It is shaped by repeated ordinary behaviors. The choices you make in your kitchen when nobody is watching.
The meal you save. The food you store. The shortcut you repeat.
The assumption you never question. Those small moments accumulate. And over time, they matter far more than most people realize. So the next time you open the fridge and see leftover rice, leftover chicken, cooked spinach or yesterday's eggs, do not ask only, "Can I reheat this?" Ask a better question.
Ask, "Should I?"
That one question can change the way you handle food for the rest of your life. And once you start asking it, you will never look at leftovers the same way again.